Welcome to the NZ Everyday Investor. I'm your host, Darcy Ungaro, and I'm sitting with Leeanna Kohn-Hardy. Welcome, Leeanna.
Hi, Darcy. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Now, tell us how you fit into the wonderful world of building wealth and what makes you into investing.
Started a long time ago, actually. Back in the days when I was at uni, I was broke, as most students are, and looking for ways that I could make money without having to work too hard for it, as you do. Yep. So that's when I got into investing, and it actually started with a term deposit. Now, this was back in the day where you could actually get 15% on a term deposit, and that's where I started. So I took $500 out of my savings, dropped it into a term deposit, and pulled it out in 6 months with that 15%. And I thought, well, that's pretty good.
You're showing your age, Leeanna. If you had 15%, that's pretty awesome.
It was awesome, and yes, I am showing my age, so let's not talk too much about that one.
That's all right.
But that's what got me started. So,
Cool.
with I was a little bit more confident. I got a little bit more money, and then I thought, well, what else can I do? So I started looking at shares. And learned about dividends, and I thought, well, I like dividends, so invested in a couple of companies on the NZX, and not only made a bit of money there, but got some dividends from them as well. And over the years, it sort of progressed. So I've tried lots of different things since then. I've invested in foreign exchange, indices, property. I've been a day trader as well, which is pretty harrowing.
Wow,
I wouldn't recommend
well done.
that to anyone.
But that's a great baptism of fire, right? Like, how's that for an education to be a day trader and actually be dependent on that revenue?
It's
wow.
Quite a different way of thinking, and one of the biggest challenges for me and probably for a lot of day traders is the psychology behind it. So you get the highs when you make money, there are the lows when you don't make money, and it's just really learning to manage that. So it's been quite a progression. I don't day trade anymore. I'm sort of focused fully on my business at the moment, so and all my capital is going into that right now.
As that's what happens, yes.
Yeah.
So you're the founder of a company called Finapster.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us really briefly about what Finapster is, because we're going to touch on that as we go. But do you want to just tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Finapster will help retail investors manage their investments in an ethical way.
In an ethical way.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll underline that. Because it's not just about managing your investments, it's doing it in a certain way, putting a certain filter or lens with your decisions, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And you're interesting. So I didn't really realize about your background so much that you're really passionate about investing. This is who you are.
Yeah. Oh, well, look, I mean, it's taken a long time. I've done a lot of reading, and some of the reading is not that interesting. It's the type of reading that you might stare at a page and try and read it, and then you realise 5 minutes later that you haven't actually read a word on that page. And I guess that's one of the reasons that I founded Finapster is you really need something to engage you, and I think that might be one of the reasons why people are struggling to really learn and understand and take ownership of their financial well-being, is because it is quite black and white, but it's also quite dry, if you're not that engaged, then it makes it harder to be engaged. So with Finapster, if you can focus on things like your values, which you would obviously know really well, and then apply that as a lens to your investing, I think that would be a way of engaging and really help people take ownership of their financial.
Not everybody has this keen interest, and so if you can create a linkage between your core values around who you actually really are, then that can be a really meaningful way to trigger a genuine interest, right?
Absolutely, right.
Okay.
And I think we saw that a couple of years ago in the New Zealand Herald when they were talking about KiwiSaver, and a lot of providers were invested in cluster bombs and, weapons manufacturing and tobacco. And there was a significant outcry in the market, which is really good to see, because, I think people are inherently good. And you don't necessarily want to be seen to be supporting things that might harm other people or harm animals or the environment, and I think it sent a clear message out that people are interested, and when they can relate to it, it becomes meaningful to them.
Environmental, social, governance, responsible investing, ethical investing, these are all terms that are used to describe a framework for making investment decisions. And it's all about tackling a problem. So as much as we possibly can, shall we just have a go at defining what the problem is that we're trying to tackle here?
Broadly, the problem is the world in which we're living and the way that we're consuming is not sustainable. We are consuming too much, we're wasting too much, we're depleting the resources that are available to us, and just looking at things like the population growth, the world won't be able to sustain us if we keep going like this. So at a really high level, that's what the problem is. So, there are a lot of things that are being implemented at the moment globally. You will have heard of the Paris Accord that a lot of countries have signed up to. There are climate commissions in I think just about every single country in the world, and even local bodies, local councils have their own targets within those high-level agreements that they need to achieve, and that's being flowed down through to people like you and me. So, those who work for companies who are now driving EVs as opposed to what was previously a petrol car, that will have trickled down from the Paris Accord to the countries' targets, to company targets, and through to us. So,
right.
I mean, we're seeing the impact of that. And, as you were saying yourself, you love driving your EV.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which is really cool.
Yeah.
And so, the more people that do that, the more likely we'll be able to meet our targets.
And for me, I know that it's not, I think I was telling you this before off air, that it's not me being an environmentalist. I do like the environment. I like the crust of the environment, the crust of the earth, probably more so than the air, but it's just me. But for me, I just love driving an electric car. I think it's just better, just awesome. I had a ride in a Model 3 yesterday with a friend, and it was phenomenal. And it just kind of highlighted this fact that I guess when we look at ethical investing, for lack of a better term, doing the right thing when we invest, we kind of sometimes maybe might imagine that it's either or. We're going to invest in a company that produces hemp straws versus plastic straws, right? Because that's the right thing to do. But I know that I'm not going to get a very good return because it's the car thing, though. Like, I was just driving this car and I just felt the acceleration, the performance, everything just looked awesome. The technology is just way ahead of what else is out there. So it's not either or. You can actually have both. You can have both. You can actually invest and do good while you invest. But I guess part of the problem is our understanding of what that is, right? Like this belief that we can't do anything, but really, we can do something.
Oh, there's lots we can do. I think we just need to make a decision on what it is we actually want to do and do it.
Right.
And look, people are already doing it. I don't know if you're familiar with, I saw in the Herald yesterday, there's about 50 Kiwi businesses closing so that they can go on this march tomorrow for climate change.
Right.
So, that's one way that people are doing it. But I think, because KiwiSaver is so prevalent in New Zealand now, that is another way that we can do it, is focusing our funds to support the businesses that are doing good or are transitioning to do good, rather than just a scattergun approach.
Okay, so Leeanna, as we get into this, can you just help define a couple of these terms that are thrown out here, ESG, SRI, all these sorts of things?
Yeah, absolutely. ESG is quite a common term that you will have heard of. E is for environmental, S is social, and G is governance. And these are sort of the three broad pillars that companies might use to, assess how they're performing and where they can potentially improve. So, for example, under E, the environment, you might look at things that impact the climate, so pollution, the amount of waste that the company is producing, the amount of energy a company uses, and so they might turn that into metrics, and to improve they might look to decrease them. And then you've got S, which is the social component, and in that aspect companies might look at their employee wellbeing policies. They might look at community engagement as two metrics to really drive their social policies.
Yeah.
And then finally, G is the governance component of it. So governance is quite broad, so it can range from looking at the level of executive pay. It could look at the risk management that a company has incorporated. It could even look at things like, how many policies are in place to make sure that the company is doing what they say they should be doing.
Is that also where you would have things like diversity on the board, not just gender, but ethnicity?
Absolutely.
And also things like customer centricity, all those sort of core values and beliefs that the board should probably have, yeah?
So, and those are broad across all companies, but obviously as you look at different sectors, there will be, different ones that are reflective of those specific sectors. So, for example, in the finance world, you'd look at, financial education and what are banks doing in that space to help people manage their money better, which is obviously quite different to, the food industry. The food industry wouldn't need to look at financial inclusion, but they'll be looking at, how can we produce food in a way that's, fresh for people, is nutritional for people, how are we being responsible about the amount of sugar that we're putting in our food. Yeah. So all those sorts of things are quite separate to, obviously the finance sector.
Yeah, which creates a challenge, doesn't it? Because how do you measure these things when it's, a financial institution versus a farmer, right? Like, how do you actually measure that? It's not as simple as just having a score out of 10, right?
It is really hard, and I think that's one of the challenges that we have at the moment as a world. There are lots of different frameworks out there that businesses can use, that investors can use, and I think the challenge, particularly at the retail investor end, is trying to get your head around the frameworks that are being used and what that means when you're trying to interpret, is this going to be a good investment for me?
Yes.
I think the key thing to really focus on is to say, well, what's important to me, and is this company actually making an effort to A, report on it, and B, do something about it ongoing, so that they're obviously continually monitoring what they're doing and they're reporting on it and they're making progress on it.
On my KiwiSaver statement, on the bottom left-hand corner, I think it is, I see this little symbol that says SRI. So what does SRI mean?
So SRI is slightly different. It does stand for socially responsible investing, and generally it's used as, or it's applied when people have a set of guidelines that they want to implement in relation to their investing. So, you might, it might be a religious set of principles, so Catholic Church or some type of church might want to set down some guidelines in terms of how they want to structure their investing. Right. Now this is quite common as well, and a lot of people are talking about it in relation to, we call it negative screening, and that's when we essentially take out all the bad stuff. So we take out the tobacco companies, we take out the bomb manufacturers, some even go to the extent of taking out pornography companies, companies who have been known to take advantage of human capital or the slave trade. So there are varying degrees, but essentially SRI looks to embed the guidelines that would address those types of considerations.
Right, okay.
And, ethical investing is another term, which you will have heard of, and that's kind of a subset of SRI, or socially responsible investing. But ethical investing is kind of more personal, so it focuses more on your own values, and uses that as the guiding principles to make your decision making.
We had Dr. Zainab Radi on the show talking about Islamic finance maybe 6 or 8 months ago, I guess. Okay. And I wish I could remember the KiwiSaver provider that she mentioned. I think it was Amana. Amana was the name of the KiwiSaver provider.
That does ring a bell, yeah.
Did that ring a bell? Mm-hmm. And that's probably a really good example of that, where the members of that KiwiSaver fund probably wouldn't want to be investing in financial institutions that made profit from interest or usury. And I thought that was kind of a really interesting, specific example of how fund managers need to actually apply some sort of metrics or screens or a set of rules when they make investment decisions, so that they're actually fitting within these value sets that some people would have, because they're not just unique one-off value sets. There's whole groups that have these things, right?
Oh, absolutely. And look, that's where another challenge lies in the industry is you will have heard of the terms active management and passive management.
Oh, yeah.
So active management is when you've got fund managers and brokers going out and they will engage with companies or other fund managers to bring together a portfolio or a fund for people to invest in. Now, the active managers can have a little bit more flexibility in terms of being able to pick and choose, but therein lies another issue, which we'll come back to in a second. The passive management side is a lot harder because what they'll do is they'll select from one or a number of funds, and they'll just leave them to essentially sit there, and they'll do some reporting on it, but they won't sort of do their checks to see, is this company performing well, is this company doing good, what's happened in the market that we should be sort of wary of.
In the active space, the tendency is to be chasing returns, and there might be more higher frequency rebalancing and trading going on, and there's some problems within that. But on the flip side, in the passive space, the lack of change might also be a problem. That
is right. And there's a structure in place which kind of inhibits some fund managers to be able to, remove all the bad companies out with 100% certainty. And an example of that is, you might have heard of Vanguard, who's an underlying fund manager. So what that means is a bank or a KiwiSaver provider might go to Vanguard and say, we're going to have this much investment for our KiwiSaver fund, and, we'd like to invest X amount with you guys. What can you do for us? But what the underlying fund managers will do is they have, and a lot of it is automated, which contributes to part of the problem. So they'll have some rules which say, we will invest in companies that do A, B, and C, to the extent that if a company is earning less than 5% or 10% in any particular sector, which might be a bad sector, we'll deem that okay. But if they're earning, 20% off a sector which we don't like, such as fossil fuels, then we'll deem that bad and we'll take them off.
I see. Right.
So what we're seeing is a compilation of, fund managers who have allowed this 5 or 10% of potentially bad stuff to creep into their fund, which makes it harder for the fund managers here and obviously for the retail investor to say, no, I don't want to be invested in fossil fuels, because ultimately over here with the fund managers, they're saying, well, it's less than 10% or it's less than 5%,
Sure.
We'll let that through.
Yes.
So, you've got a little bit of a mismatch in expectations
Sure.
around that. And, you might have heard Sam Stubbs from Simplicity say that it's actually really hard for New Zealand at the moment because we are a small nation, and we certainly don't represent the amount of funds that you might find in the US. So, when we go and ask for something, it's a bit more like a drop in the ocean rather than a big splash.
In terms of the solution or the way that this is actually worked out in reality, when everyday investors today in New Zealand are making investment decisions, how can some of these frameworks actually help them make better decisions so that their values are aligned with their investment decisions?
Yeah, so look, some of the frameworks, while they vary in how they can be approached and interpreted, largely the output should be that companies are able to identify and benchmark where they're at, and that's a necessary first step for companies to be able to do. And so they will be able to say, we have had X number of accidents in the last 12 months, and moving forward we're going to put policy A, B and C in place, and at the end of 12 months we anticipate that we will have halved the number of accidents on our site. So broadly that's what the framework should enable these companies to do. And so what investors should be looking for is where are their benchmarks and what have they got in place to help change that and decrease it, and looking for that metric at the end of the 12 months and say, have they improved or have they not? And if they haven't improved, then obviously something's not quite right there, and maybe depending on how comfortable the investor is with what happened or what didn't happen, that might be cause for review.
Right. So on one side of these metrics, let's take ESG as a really simple one. Mm-hmm. The investor is looking at the ESG framework in order to make good investment decisions that are aligned with their values. Mm-hmm. The firm on the other end, whether it's the actual firm or a fund manager on the other end, is looking at the same metric, but they're looking at it from the other side of the glass, aren't they?
Yeah.
The outcome will still be a great outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was great to hear at the Responsible Investment conference earlier this week that there are a large number of fund managers who are engaging with companies to really promote some of these factors that they can incorporate into their practices.
Awesome. Yeah.
And they use that, they incorporate that in their valuations of the companies.
Yes.
Before they, go out to the market and say, here's our recommendation and here's what we think the company's worth. Yeah. And they'll go on to say why people should invest in that company. Right. And it's metrics like these that can really help improve the valuations of companies. So if you think about it, if a company is having a lot of on-site accidents, and that's probably costing them a lot in terms of lost productivity and having to get staff in and train them up to cover for that person while they're off sick, and so all these implications which are costly, where if a company has some health and safety practices in place, then they're less likely to have workplace accidents, so less people take time off and there's more productivity, and so if you sort of follow that process through, then it kind of makes sense that when a company is trying to do good by their staff, for example, and they're saying we've got these practices in place so you don't get hurt and people follow them, then it can only be a good thing.
That's right.
And
That's
obviously when people don't get hurt, they'll be happier, and
when I'm dead, I'm way less happier than when I'm alive.
Yeah.
But how would it work, like, in practice? So I'm an investor and I'm considering investing in, and sorry to pick on a company, I just can't think of anybody else right now, Air New Zealand. So I want to invest in Air New Zealand, and I want to know whether or not, and we'll use this example that you've just drawn on, whether they have good practices in the area of health and safety. And I want to go as specific as finding out whether or not they offer free health insurance, not just for the employees, but the employee's family. Because I've done my own research, and I believe that that's actually going to result in good outcomes for everybody. Share price and employees, and therefore me. So tell me, how does it work in reality? Is it easy for me to find out, like if I was to do some research with Air New Zealand as an investor, could I find out whether they offer free health insurance for their employees and their family?
Yes, you probably could. Air New Zealand probably do have amazing staff packages.
Air New Zealand, tell us if you do. Sorry, comment somewhere.
I do know. I had a couple of friends who work for Air New Zealand, and they get amazing travel benefits, and I'm so jealous.
That's right. Yeah.
So
that's
I'm
right.
sure
So that's got to be good.
I'm sure insurance falls in there somewhere.
Yeah.
But look, Air New Zealand is one of those countries companies that's undergoing some amazing transformation at the moment, and I have some amazing debates with people around what they're doing, because some people will say, oh no, not Air New Zealand, massive fossil fuel user, that can't be good for the planet, I'm never going flying again. And there are actually some people that say that. And then you've got, people like, and I fall into this camp as well, who say, well, actually you can't just not use fossil fuels tomorrow. There has to be a period of transformation where people can sort of adapt and make changes while still supplying the services that everyone is asking for. And I think some of the things that they're doing is really good in that space. So the ability for people to buy carbon credits, and they're shortening their routes, and what you were saying before about short haul electric flights, which would be amazing.
Oh, yeah.
But none of this happens overnight. So I think you have to allow for a transformational period in order for people to do that.
And that's why I think I just keep on coming back to that picture of, you've got the ESG guidelines, reference points, and then you have the firm over here trying to rise up to it, but often the expectation of the investor is way the hell up here. You should just divest immediately from everything that's using fossil fuels. That's kind of like what we would love right now, but that's just not practical. And what do? Do you exclude that from your portfolio, or do you include them with an attempt to come alongside them and encourage them actively to kind of follow the path, right? And therein lies the challenge, right? Sometimes you need to exclude, sometimes you have to remain inclusive.
Yeah, and that was an interesting topic of debate at this Responsible Investment Conference earlier this week. Right. Because in New Zealand, as shareholders of companies, we can actually help set agendas. We can add our points of interest to agendas, and we can get people to consider it and to vote on it. And it's actually really easy for us in New Zealand as shareholders to do that. And it's a pity that not enough of us are doing it. Because, I was talking to a woman who lives in Australia, and it's a lot harder for people in Australia as shareholders to be able to influence the companies that they're invested in. They actually have to, if they want to set an item on an agenda, they actually have to get 100 parties to support that piece before it gets put onto the agenda, which makes it a lot harder. So, I think we're quite lucky in New Zealand in that respect.
So maybe, why don't you just take 2 seconds and give a message to New Zealand shareholders right now who actually are investing in New Zealand companies in terms of encouraging them to actually speak out, because they can, right?
Absolutely. And I'm absolutely going to do that.
Good.
It's interesting. I saw an article in the Herald this morning that says that there's only, I think, about 42 companies out of the 170 that we have on the NZX who are actually reporting on the environmental factors, so the E from ESG, which is pretty shocking. And what's even more shocking is that there's only about 70 companies on the NZX who are actually doing any sort of reporting at all on ESG.
Wow.
And I think as shareholders, because a lot of us will be invested in, some of those companies on the NZX, we have a right to know, and it is actually quite easy for us to ask them to do that. So, when the AGM pack gets sent out, there will be paperwork in there which says, would you like to add anything to our agenda at the AGM? This is our opportunity to say, well, yes, actually we do. We want to know what are you doing in relation to providing more equality across your business, or how are you impacting the environment, and setting that expectation that we actually want to know, where at the moment none of that's really happening.
Right.
And that will probably be why not many people are reporting on it.
Right. So really the question that we would be asking at these AGMs is, why aren't you reporting on these ESG metrics?
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Been investing for a long time, and no doubt you seem like the type of person who's probably all over the data as well. You probably look at patterns and performance and stuff like that. I'm keen to know something about correlation, because in my mind, going back to this kind of either or thing, I would think that if you're using these ESG principles to screen investment opportunities, you may have a lower performance out of your portfolio, right? That would be maybe a common thought. Is that true? Like, what's the correlation between exercising these ESG principles and performance of a portfolio?
That is an interesting question, because there does seem to still be a perception in the market that investors have to make a choice between doing good or actually making money. But there are actually a lot of research papers out now, and some of them are studies that have taken place over 30 years, which have looked at they've looked at indices, they've looked at baskets of companies, and this is globally, and all those studies are showing that companies that implement ESG practices and have them firmly embedded actually perform better than companies that don't. And I think if you sort of think that through, it makes a little bit of sense as to why that would happen. So, if we look at that workplace incident again and people who have health and safety practices implemented, it does mean that less people take time off, and it does mean that people are more productive. And if people are have the opportunity to train and to learn, and they have the flexibility to take paternity leave or maternity leave, that makes for happier staff, and they're more likely to stay, so the knowledge stays within your company. And so there's all these sort of intangible benefits that you get that obviously contribute to that underlying valuation of a company, where conversely, a company that doesn't have as strong as practices, you might see people taking more sick days off just off the bat, or you might see a higher staff turnover. And obviously the cost of staff turnover, both from a human resource perspective and also from a knowledge perspective, also has impacts, not so great impacts on a company.
Yeah,
so,
right.
Thinking those through, it sort of makes sense that companies that do implement ESG policies are likely to be stronger.
It does. And I guess maybe in the short term, you might get a short spike in profitability if you ignored these principles. Like, I'm just thinking of a really basic example of sending somebody up on the roof to paint a roof without any safety gear. Like, in the short term, that might give you a little bit of a boost in turnover because there's less downtime setting up gear, right? But in the long term, half of your employees are going to be dead pretty soon, right? Because it's going to rain, they're going to fall off and die. I guess using these principles, it kind of highlights this other broader theme that cuts to the core of who we are as people, that if you're a knob and you act in a really knobbish way, eventually it's going to catch up with you, right?
Oh, absolutely. In every aspect. I mean, you look at companies who don't treat their staff well, who don't engage with their community, who, sell their products at a really high price. Those companies aren't going to last in that community for much longer because people are like, well, they don't treat their staff very well, their products are a rip-off, they take us for granted. Why should we support them? So,
Correct.
It goes both ways.
Yeah, because it's such a small community. If you're acting really poorly with your employees, like I get this all the time, where people are being made redundant or they're resigning from their employer because it's just such a toxic environment. And I've seen this recently with a big group, publicly traded company that will go nameless, where I'm getting a lot of negative feedback from real people who work there saying it's a toxic environment to work in. Am I going to invest in that company? No, because it's just not smart. It's not right either, but it's just not smart. And so there is this correlation in the long term between good performance and good behavior.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we can't kind of contract out that responsibility. We want a good return for our investment, but we can't just contract that out because there's that negative externality around when you want profit. Unless you do it in a certain way, it will create negative outcomes elsewhere. So you just have to be kind of thoughtful with how we invest now, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess, that's another big challenge that we're facing right now as well is, and people are having to choose at the moment. So the impacts of, making a certain decision obviously has a flow-on effect. Because, India they have banned vaping. Which on the surface sounds really good, but if you look at India's economy, it's actually largely driven from tobacco. So once you know that, you see that, well, they've obviously banned vaping to support their tobacco industry, which is good because it supports their people, and their people remain employed, but the tobacco industry as a whole, not that good.
That's such a tough one, isn't it?
It is, and that's one of the questions that come up, isn't it? Is, do you continue to, of course you would want to support your people because, without the people around you, then you haven't got much of a livelihood really, but,
That's
to
right.
support the tobacco industry is a whole nother question. So,
Yeah.
And I think that sort of comes into that whole transitioning period where, and I think it's like Taranaki actually, where it came out in the news a few months ago that they were going to shut down the oil company there. And there was a big outcry because obviously that community thrives on that. It's a real shame that what they didn't come out and say was, well, actually, we've got a strategy for transitioning that community from their reliance on oil to something else, which might be tourism.
Correct. Yeah.
So that didn't come out in the media, but there is that transitional period where, as we move away from our reliance on fossil fuels, there will be other opportunities.
Yeah. And there is this kind of substitution flavor going out throughout that, right? Where it's not just, hey, you're not allowed to do that anymore. It's more like you need to have a plan now to substitute or to transition. Makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, everyone's responsible for their own learning and development as part of their well-being. So, and I think that will be really key for people to, really help drive that transition is to maintain that learning and development.
Okay. Now, I want to throw a little bit of a curveball-ish question because we haven't talked about this before, but I just wanted to know your thoughts on medicinal cannabis as a sector to invest in, because there is now an option where you can invest in New Zealand in a publicly listed cannabis company, and there's a whole host of pros and cons with that, and it's a whole debate that goes with that. But putting this responsible investing filter across this, do you have a view on that you want to share in light of the fact there's a referendum coming up next year on this topic?
I actually had a really interesting debate with my dad on this a couple of weeks ago. My dad is very much in the mind that cannabis is a drug and drugs are bad, therefore it's a no-go from him. From my point of view, I'm a little bit more relaxed about cannabis. I think if we're able to embrace it as an industry, we can therefore talk about it more, and there will be less incidents happening, less negative incidents happening because of it, because we're talking about it, where at the moment, we don't talk about these things, and, the potential for more harm to be done because we don't talk about them is higher. And because of that, I'm supportive of it. Richard Branson, who was over here a couple of years ago, who said, we should stop with our farming and grow cannabis because that would be just as profitable and a lot less toxic on the environment.
Well, bring back those hemp straws. Tell me what you think about hemp. We talk about cannabis, but tell me what you think about hemp.
I've heard that, hemp plants can grow 15 feet twice in a season, which is obviously a lot faster than a lot of other crops available to us at the moment. It can be turned into a massive number of things, including food-grade plastic for things like bread, which is brilliant.
Bags as well? Probably, Yeah.
And it is able to turn carbon dioxide into oxygen a lot faster than some of the other plants. So, when you look at it from that respect, hemp is not a bad plant at all.
No, and it makes you wonder why has it been suppressed for so long? Food, packaging, fuel, paper, clothing.
Yep.
You name it. It just keeps going. Like oil is actually a pretty poor substitute.
It kind of is.
Yeah. Okay. So now what other controversial topic can we discuss? Leeanna, so far what I've learned about you is that you are an everyday NZ investor. You are an everyday Kiwi doing investing. Passionate about it. You're passionate about the frameworks that we use as well, and bringing kind of responsibility, environmental, social, good governance practices to the table here. How are you currently expressing it? And what I'm getting at is, tell me about the business that you're involved in.
Yeah, look, so Fnapster was sort of born from my experience of trying to learn about investing and wading through quite a bit of information that was pretty dry and, if I'm honest, not that interesting. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to look at socially responsible investing and say, well, actually, we know what our values are, and like the clothes we wear, we would want our investments to reflect who we are. And, talking to a lot of people now, it seems to be more of an expectation rather than a nice to have. And that's what Finapster will be developed on, is enabling people to align their investments with their values in a really easy way. So not disregarding, of course, the existing ways of selecting investments, but certainly providing a bit of an overlay and more transparency around what people are actually invested in.
And currently you're working with Creative HQ, you're in an incubator. Do you want to talk to me about that a little bit?
Yeah, but they've taken 200 startups from really early stage conception and really helped them grow, and I think those startups are earning an aggregate of over 25 million at the moment, so we've got high hopes for Finapster in this incubator. Awesome.
So what people can use Finapster right now, because I had to look at it and you can sign up right now.
Absolutely.
But that's the Finapster as it is right now, and going forward obviously it'll be transformed as you work on this going through the incubator, no doubt, right?
That's right. So we've got a beta version in market at the moment. So, when you sign up, you'll be able to have a look at your shares and your crypto, if you've got any crypto. We are looking to, depending on what happens in this incubator, we will be looking to polish it up a lot.
Yeah. Gotcha. So in my mind anyway, I'm just looking at, because I use Grammarly a lot when I'm writing stuff.
And it's brilliant.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great little plugin to have if you're not really good at using there versus there. It's a great way to, or Sarah with an H, no, not quite. But it's a really great plugin to have when you're doing stuff. So are you kind of thinking that Finapster could be kind of like that whatever the platform is that you're using to invest in, whether it's one of these online investment platforms or even via an advisor, you'd be able to have this plugin which would kind of give you some visibility around some of these ESG principles. Is that the idea?
Absolutely. So we want to make it as easy as possible for people to use. And so we're not asking them necessarily to use yet another system to manage their investments, because they'll already have their banking app, they might have a KiwiSaver provider, they might have a share trader. That's already 3 apps, right? And so Finapster being a 4th app probably wouldn't be viewed that favourably, but if they could use their banking app and see Finapster's information on top of that, or if they were using their their Hatch app or their Sharesies app, and they could see Finapster's information on top of that, then that just makes it easier for them.
Yes, I get it. Awesome, bring it on. You're doing good work. Thank you. Work, so keep it up. Appreciate that.
You.
And I'd love to catch up with you again at some stage. When does the incubator period finish, and what's the natural progression and with how that works?
So they say 6 to 12 months. I'm working on Finapster full-time at the moment, so I anticipate I'll probably be closer to the 6-month mark. So probably towards the end of this year. We will be at the end of that. But obviously that's not the end of the story for Finapster. We've got lots of big targets that we want to achieve, so we'll be keeping on.
Okay, so if people want to actually follow you and see what you're doing, what's the best way? LinkedIn? I subscribe to the newsletter on the finapster.co.nz website.
Absolutely. So we're on all the main social channels. We've got our website, so sign up to our newsletter. It only goes out quarterly, so we certainly won't be spamming you at all.
No, that's good. And it's Finappster, just in case people are wondering.
That is
Finapster,
yes.
Like Napster, but Finapster.
Yes.
Okay. How's that? All right. Well, awesome. Well, thank you very much, Leeanna, for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Cool. And we'll catch you next time around, hopefully soon.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks, Darcy.
Cheers.